In this video, we're going to look at evolution. We're going to look at Darwin's theory. Charles Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species in about 1859, and he had a bunch of mechanisms where populations change over time. So in this video, we're specifically going to look at microevolution, which is when we have small changes in a population in a single species over periods of time. In a previous video, we talked about how when we produce gametes, we mix up the DNA. We can produce different alleles, we have hybrid chromosomes. Basically, every gamete and every offspring, unless they're identical twins, are different. So every organism, from bacteria to plants and animals, have different combinations of alleles that will make them either able to survive in their environment that they're born into, or less likely to survive in that environment. Evolution is defined as changes in populations over time. I also want to emphasize that an individual organism cannot evolve. Individuals are born with the DNA that they got. In humans, we got 23 chromosomes from our mom and 23 from our dad, and that's the DNA that we have. If we have an allele for cystic fibrosis, we can't change that. If we have alleles that give us brown hair or freckles, then that's the DNA that we've inherited from our parents' gametes. An individual can adapt. So adaptation is different from evolution. An individual organism can adapt to changes in the environment. I'll give you an example. Let's suppose you live on a mountain and you increase your altitude where oxygen concentration is lower. Then you can regulate the expression of the genes that affect red blood cell production. So your DNA doesn't change, but the regulation of the DNA can change. So you can increase the expression of the hormone, let's say erythropoietin, and you can increase your production of red blood cells so that you can adapt to that higher altitude. But your DNA isn't going to change. Okay, so populations can evolve and individuals can adapt. When we look at Darwin's theory of evolution, he had a few specific factors that played a significant role in changes that happen in populations over time. One thing that is very important is genetic variation. And we've talked about this in other videos. It is important for meiosis and fertilization and crossing over and independent assortment and all those factors to increase the variation of alleles that exist in new organisms. So in a whole population, the more genetic variation that exists, the healthier that whole population will be. The genetic variation is based on having different combinations of alleles. All organisms over-reproduce. If you look at this example of baby turtles, only 1% of baby turtles make it from eggs to adults. Look at how much plants reproduce. They produce tons of seeds and fruit. How many of those actually end up growing into a new plant, right? Humans also over-reproduce. Survival of the fittest is an expression that has been used to describe natural selection. When organisms are born with their combination of DNA, of alleles, whatever environment they are born into, if their combination of alleles allows them to survive that environment, then they will be the ones that pass on their DNA to their offspring. And gametes and offspring always have different combinations of alleles. Sometimes there might be new alleles if there are DNA mutations. And then this cycle will continue on. So now these new offspring in the population have their combination of alleles. There is genetic variation in the population. They will over-reproduce, and the ones that are the fittest are going to survive. And this cycle continues on and on and on over many, many generations And then over time, the populations will change. This is evolution. Changes in populations over time. There are two kinds of evolution. We can sort of categorize these into microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is when you have small changes in allele frequencies or different combinations of genes in offspring over time in the same species. And then macroevolution is when those changes become so dramatic that a new species comes about. So an organism is considered a different species if it can no longer interbreed. There are selection pressures that will affect which alleles make an organism fit or not. In a population, let's suppose you have a population of gazelles, and there is a predator that wants to eat the gazelles. Which gazelle is going to get eaten? The slowest, the oldest, the sickest, the ones that are not the fittest. When we have a predator like a cheetah, then the cheetah acts like a selection pressure on the population of gazelles. Okay, so we'll look at a few different examples. So here we have a predator-prey relationship, right? So the predator is the selection pressure acting on the population of, I'm assuming this is a gazelle, I don't know, it could be a deer. And so the population of prey has to have the right characteristics to be able to survive its predators. There are other kinds of things that can act like selection pressures, like environmental changes. Say, for example, a forest fire. Forest fires will kill a majority of the organisms in that area. However, new organisms will start to grow. So new plants seeds will be triggered by the fire. When larger trees are gone, then the smaller plants have more sunshine, and then the whole evolution of this forest will regrow, and it will be a little bit different the next time that it grows. We can even affect the evolution of bugs in our backyard. There are insects that are drawn towards light. Before we had modern electricity, bugs were drawn to moonlight and it helped them fly in a straight path. So we hang up bug zappers and the bugs are mesmerized by the light and they fly into it and then we electrocute them. So what we're doing is we are killing off a portion of that population of bugs in our backyard. So the bug zapper is actually acting like a selection pressure. With evolution, microevolution of the bugs in your backyard, some of them do not have a gene that makes them drawn to the light. That gene could be mutated. If that gene is mutated, they won't fly into your bug zapper. So then they will technically, in your backyard, be the fittest bugs. So that's kind of cool. This is a picture of antibiotics. Antibiotics are drugs that kill bacteria. When we have an infection, like, let's suppose we have a strep throat infection. We have extra streptococcus bacteria growing in our throat, and we take an antibiotic. Some bacteria have genes for antibiotic resistance. So in the environment of your throat, when you take the antibiotics, you're going to kill a large proportion of the bacterial population, but not necessarily all of them. If there are some bacteria that have resistance genes, then they won't die. So the bacteria that have the resistance DNA, they are going to be the fittest in the environment with the selection pressure that is antibiotics. And then sometimes just being born the right color can make you fitter. In this example, I'm showing you some peppered moths. And in different environments, each peppered moth will be fitter. So being the fittest in an environment does not necessarily mean that you have to be bigger and faster and stronger. Sometimes those traits are important. If you're trying to catch a gazelle for dinner, then you need to be able to run pretty fast. But sometimes just having the right coloring or camouflage prevents you from being eaten by a predator. So then, in this example, we can see that the dark peppered moth can more easily blend into its environment than the white peppered moth. So in this example, let's suppose the selection pressure is a bird that likes to eat moths. Then the fittest will be the one that can blend into its environment, and the bird that is going to eat one of them will be the selection pressure. So selection pressures are factors that kill a portion of the population. So they act on that population to cause evolution to occur. I want to talk a little bit more about antibiotic resistance. Let's suppose you have an original population of bacteria. Let's suppose this is Streptococcus bacteria, and it can cause a strep throat infection. If we have genetic variation, so you can see that in this population, there are a lot of different alleles in these bacterial organisms. Let's suppose the light color means that they're not resistant to antibiotics, and if the dark color shows that they're very resistant to antibiotics, what will happen to this original population when we introduce a selection pressure? This population is going to change. As the lighter colored bacteria that are not resistant to antibiotics, as they are killed off by the selection pressure, the population is going to evolve so that more organisms with antibiotic resistance exists. Those bacteria are going to be the fittest, and now the population has changed. So this is microevolution because the population is different over time. I also want to point out that as the environment changes, then different allele combinations are going to make organisms fitter. So if we take away the antibiotics, then that bacterial population will change again. Perhaps there will be some other factor that acts on the population, making different bacterial organisms more likely to survive. This is why microevolution is always ongoing. As long as the environment is changing, then the allele frequencies are always going to change. Different organisms are going to be fit in different environments. I want to compare Darwin's theory to one other evolutionary biologist called Lamarck, and he had a different idea at the time. He thought that traits were passed on, because actually also remember that when Darwin figured out his theory of evolution, he was traveling around the Galapagos Islands and he was looking at different organisms of finches and iguanas, and he was just observing changes in populations over time. He did not know that DNA was passed on. He didn't know that those traits were because of alleles. Lamarck, he believed that traits were passed on because of behaviors. So the famous example is the giraffes. If we look at ancestral giraffes, they were much shorter than the tall giraffes that exist today. So how did that happen? Why did giraffe populations evolve? Lamarck's idea was that giraffes had to stretch their necks to reach food that was higher up. So to be competitive and to get enough food and to be the fittest organism, you had to be able to stretch your neck to be able to reach the food. And as time went on, these taller giraffes were the ones that had babies, and then those babies stretched their necks. And then many generations later, we have tall giraffes. I want to point out how this theory is different from Darwin's theory. When Darwin would look at a giraffe population, he would say there is genetic variation in the giraffe population. Some of the giraffes have slightly longer necks than others. So when food is a type of selection pressure where if you can't get food, you don't have energy to reproduce, then the taller giraffes that already exist, they will find the food, they will reproduce and pass on their tall DNA. So the difference between Lamarck and Darwin is that you are born with the traits that you're born with. But there's a cool thing that I actually want to mention. Lamarck wasn't completely off his rocker because we have now what we call epigenetics, above genetics, where we can actually change the regulation of gene expression. So an example is baby rats. If they aren't licked by their mother, they will feel stress. They will actually alter their stress response genes so that later on in adulthood, they become much more anxious rats compared to baby rats that were groomed when they were little. So there are factors that can impact how DNA is regulated. So that is epigenetics. How many species do you think are here? Do you think this is showing 6 different species? This is actually all one species. With dogs, they are all Canis familiaris. They are all the same species, but there are about 340 different breeds of dog. And how did all of these come about? At some point in time, maybe these will become completely different species. A different species is when they can no longer interbreed. There, I would argue, there are some breeds of dog that would not naturally interbreed. All of these breeds exist partly because of artificial selection. Artificial selection is when humans impact evolution. We can choose the character traits of different organisms that we want to pass on. So we can choose which cows to breed to get the most milk, which chickens to produce the most eggs. A lot of our food has come about from artificial selection. This plant here is an ancestral mustard plant. And through different kinds of artificial selection, we have caused the evolution of different kinds of foods. These are all from cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and Brussels sprouts. They're all in the same family. So different characteristics became more important to humans. And then those plants were bred to cause these changes over time. So artificial selection is when humans impact the evolution of a species. One other example that I want to talk about, an example of microevolution. Let's suppose we have a population of guppies, cute little colorful fish that we put in our fish tanks. If we have a population of guppies, and then we move them into slightly different geographical locations. There was an experiment done in Trinidad where there was a higher pool and a lower pool, and they were connected by a little river that dried up. And then those 2 pools of guppies lived in different environments. In one of those pools, there was a predator. A pike is a type of fish that likes to eat guppies. So then what happens to the guppy populations over time? You take the same population, we put them in 2 different geographical locations with different selection pressures. There are some key changes that occurred in those guppies because the guppy population with the pike, they had to evade a predator. So then the alleles that became the fittest were now different than the alleles that made the other population fit. So in the one population, being very bright and colorful was a fit phenotype because it attracted mates and allowed them to reproduce. But when there is a predator introduced to the population, now the guppies that are less colorful are more likely to survive. The less colorful ones can blend into the environment, not as easily visible by the predator. The guppies with the predator also began reproducing at an earlier age, and they became faster swimmers, and they grew to a smaller adult size. So a bunch of different changes occurred when we separated these organisms into 2 different geographical locations. If we take a quick look at the human population, 10,000 years ago was about the beginning of the agricultural revolution. Homo sapiens have existed for about 200,000 years, and it's really only been in the last couple hundred years where we've had this massive explosion in the population. Modern medicine, for example, was really only decently not killing people since about the mid-1800s. Before this, all kinds of selection pressures affected humans. Things like infections, being able to find food, surviving childbirth. There were always wars and battles and violence between different groups of people. People could die from injuries and accidents, and there even used to be predatory animals. Do these factors still affect humans in the same way? Infections are probably still one of the most significant selection pressures, so humans have evolved to have very strong immune systems. And we have things like healthcare and medicine and antibiotics, and we can do surgeries, and we have insulin for diabetics and glasses for people that have poor vision. There's so many different things that humans have intervened with. I would be curious if you wrote in the comments below what you think current selection pressures are for humans.